Hello and welcome to this game review. We'll have quite a complicated game here, so let's get into it. So it started as this Dutch defense type of thing. d3 is probably the best move, trying to sacrifice the pawn here. d6, e4, e5. Pretty sure this is how black plays. And white decides to take on f5. In general, white should avoid letting black consolidate, as clearly black is not really developing his pieces, he's kind of weakening his king. But if he gets to develop, then he will have a pretty good position with harmonious development. So generally white has to do something with d4, for example knight c3, after knight c6, takes, and d4. This is one of the ways to play, and white opens the position favorably, hopefully castles queenside, and attacks while black is still not developed. In the game, black took back on f5, knight c3 and knight c6, and here as well we have transposed. White should play d4, as this is his point, opening up the position while black has not consolidated. Because we have to understand that the static advantage is with black, as he has two pawns in the center. So if he gets them solid and develops the pieces, then black will be better. So white should fight against this, and white is a little bit better here because he is better developed, and the black king is in a little bit of trouble. Instead bishop e3, but now black gets to take the center, and he shouldn't have many problems. c6, bishop e2, and now we get this position. Again, black is undeveloped, but the position is quite closed, so black is doing fine, but he should be trying to develop as fast as possible. Knight e7 happened, castles, and knight g6, but this is not very accurate, as it leaves the bishop undefended on f5, which will make black lose some more tempi, and he will not be able to castle kingside in time. Instead, bishop e6 or g6 should be played to develop as fast as possible. And now white opens the center correctly, and queen f1. But unfortunately queen f1, even though natural, the queen on f1 will be a bit out of play, and it will take a while to get it back in the game. And instead, white should play quite dynamically here, and there are quite interesting variations like queen d4, with the point that now if black plays the natural bishop e7, white can sacrifice on f5, and after this he can sacrifice even more. And the point of this one is very nice. Black cannot take back because of queen a4 check. So if the king goes to the f file, we win the queen. Otherwise, if it goes here, this is a skewer towards the d7 square. Otherwise, if the queen blocks, this is also bishop e5. And what else? Well, there's not much else. So black cannot recapture, and even though here black is an exchange up, white does have a pawn, the king is stuck in the center, so there is quite a decent compensation. And here we even get a pretty decent endgame for white. Two bishops and a pawn against a rook and a knight is usually enough compensation. So instead queen f1, but this is not dynamic enough. Now the bishop moves. Bishop d4, this is also a bit passive. We should try to get our pieces in the game as fast as possible. Something like knight a4 comes to mind, threatening to take the bishop pair and hopefully install a bishop on d6. This gives up the pawn on e5, but white shouldn't worry about this, as the priority is now the king. The king cannot castle kingside or queenside. And for example, after bishop d6, bishop d4, white can continue with rook e1 and moving the bishop, and the king is in some danger. Although objectively black is fine, it is a bit dangerous. After this, black plays this maneuver to f5, and the white's construction is not very solid. He plays knight b5, an enterprising move. It's not really threatening much, apart from the pawn on a7, but black shouldn't have worried about the pawn on a7. He should just develop. And after this, white does not really have much. If he goes here, black will just take the bishop. Otherwise, if here, black can just castle, and now all of the pieces are hanging. but a6 was played, and now white played the nice move bishop d3, and now it's actually white who has the advantage, namely because of this king who is stuck in the center. And the problem with this king is not exactly that it's going to be checkmated, but more so it's about the rooks and how they are not connected, and one of them will be out of play, most likely this one. It looks like it's active and it has some kind of possibilities, but after some simple moves like a3 and c3, the rook on a8 will be a bit out of play, which is mainly black's problem. So a few moves later, black tries to solve this problem by exchanging one rook and trying to put the king on g8 manually. And this is what white allows. Here, white shouldn't have taken on f8, which he did quite quickly because now the king goes to g8 and this rook is allowed to go to f8, and black no more has any problems. Here white had the kind of intuitive sacrifice rook f6, putting the rook right into black's position. If black takes, then the dark squares will be extremely weak. Still, this rook is completely out of play, and it will be very difficult to get it into play. White has easy moves like a3 and rook e1. And the bishop can go to c5, maybe even e7. Some ideas like h4, h5 come to mind to activate this one. And white is better. Black's position is quite dangerous. This pawn is also strong. But instead, after this, black kind of equalizes. And now we get to play b4. b4 is not a very strong move, but still white should have played a4, leaving the pawn here, getting rid of the tension, because after bishop c5, this allows black to create some weaknesses in white's camp. Here d4 was a strong move, which black did not see, the point being that after this exchanges, black can take the pawn on a3, and at the end of this he can take even here, and we get this bishop endgame where black's pawns are a bit better because white has more pawn islands. Black will try to get his king to e6 and hopefully take the pawn on e5, though the position objectively should be a draw. Instead black took here, and now we get some exchanges, and after queen c7 the position is about equal, but black is the one pressing because he has less pawn islands. There are 2 pawn islands against 1, 2, 3, 4, so white will have a harder time controlling his own weaknesses. And here white cracked under the pressure with queen d6, which should give him a lost bishop endgame, because the pawn on d6 will not really go anywhere, it will be picked off. Instead, white should just activate his pieces, maybe queen a7 for example, or queen e3, going back. And of course the position is a bit unpleasant, but white does have ideas of putting the queen on f6, after which he should at least usually have a perpetual check, in case black goes taking stuff. But after queen d6, this should lose, as usually bishop endgames without a pawn are lost. So is this one, and this pawn is basically gone. King f7, king f6, and white could fight on, for example, with here and c3 with the point of playing king d4 to get some kind of control of dark squares, but still after kicking back the king, black should be quite a bit better, though after g3, as we will see similarly to the game, it's not that hard, not that easy to break through with black. And after h3, black should win quite easily with king e5, d4, and c5, picking up the pawn and continuing to advance. But h6, the point was to put pawns on dark squares, but this is a bit too slow. White should have played h4 first to exchange some pawns, and after g5 we could get this position which happened in the game, and for example c3 and taking. White should be kind of fine if he finds this maneuver to provoke c5, and now very importantly g3. As we will see in the game, this move is extremely important. So what happened in the game was the king went to g3, but this is kind of useless because after g5 the king will have to go back to e3 anyway. All of the squares are controlled. This is why it's important to put pawns on the opposite color of our bishop, because now the bishop can control one complex and the pawn controls the other. h4, king e5, we take, king f3, and now the position should be more or less winning for black if he finds the right moves, which are king c5, starting with this. The point being that we want to play b5 and b4 at some point, perhaps, or king b6 to a5 and picking up this pawn. For example, g3. We should probably move the bishop somewhere, and white is going to be in Zugzwang. For example, c3, bishop d1. The bishop can get maneuvered to c4, and eventually white will have to give up the c4 square or allow d4 to let the black king infiltrate further. But king e5 is actually not winning after c3. Black plays c5, which is fine, but objectively not. There are no more winning moves for black. But here white had to find the move g3, which both players did not understand. It was very important to take away the square of f4, because black's winning plan here is to push the king away and then bring the king to g3 to attack the pawn on g2, which we both did not understand. So if g3, it will be quite difficult to make any progress. Now if at any point d4 happens, similarly to the game, this is kind of a fortress because black cannot break through. Instead, after bishop b5, black plays the move which is kind of aimed at not hurrying and putting more pawns in dark squares, but this is a big blunder. We should have just pushed, or black should have pushed, with the point of putting the king on f4 and going towards this pawn. After b6, now white plays g3, which is a very good move. And now a lot of maneuvering happens. Generally, this should be a draw, but white should not allow the king towards this pawn on g3, which is the only weakness. The king on d2 is safe enough, and white should just not allow black to attack neither of these pawns. So bishop b5 was a mistake because this allows the black king to infiltrate with king f5, threatening this. The point is now if check, then king e4, and it's impossible to stop this. For example, if bishop g4, then black will create a Zugzwang, for example here, and if here bishop d7, and we can move around further, but now even d3 works with the point of going here. But king e4 is a mistake by black, and now it's a draw again with king e2, not allowing king f3. Some more maneuvering happens. Black tries to somehow trick the opponent, and here after king c4, the threat, well, there's not a really big threat here, because after king b3 there is king d3, and more pawns will be exchanged, and white's king will be a lot more centralized, which will allow him to go towards this pawn to get counterplay. So there is actually no threat here, but we should not allow black to get into this diagonal. To get to g6 with tempo. So here, for example, bishop f5 should work. The point being that the bishop cannot go here. Bishop c8 also works, because now if here, we can always go back to this diagonal to give a check and kick the king away from this pawn. So this endgame is quite complicated, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand everything here, but this is sort of the idea that here black is not really threatening anything, so white needs to find a good waiting move. So bishop c8 or bishop f5 work. If bishop g4, then now this is not good for white. For example here, apparently this is winning for black. I'm not entirely sure why. I guess this bishop is not on a good square. It will have trouble stopping this pawn. As in the game, king c2 happened, but now after bishop g6, the white king has to allow either king b3 or king d3 or d3. So this is allowed, but after king b3, black finally gets to this pawn. It's forced to get pushed, and this king is not allowed to d3. And now that this pawn is on a light square, the game is easily won for black. The bishop wants to go to c6, and of course all pawn endgames are lost. So quite a difficult game for both sides. Hopefully this was somewhat logical and hopefully it was instructive.